She didn't buy a one-way ticket. She bought time, and didn't even know it yet. Riley stood on that train platform with steady hands and a chest full of everything she refused to say out loud. She was running, yes. But New York has a strange way of stopping people mid-flight, especially when the right stranger is already waiting on the same platform, carrying his whole life on his back and a silence that somehow sounds like home. What happens next? She never could have planned. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love knowing who's on this journey with me.
This is David. Ready to dive into another love story? Let's go.
Chapter 1. The 6:47 a.m. Amtrak pulled away from South Station with a low mechanical groan that felt to Riley Caldwell like the sound of a decision finally made. She sat in window seat 14C, her dark coat still buttoned to the collar despite the warmth inside the car, fingers wrapped tight around the strap of her leather tote, a reflex more than a choice, like holding on to the only solid thing left in a world that had quietly been dissolving for months. Boston disappeared behind grey morning fog. The skyline shrank. The glassy towers, the familiar rooftops. The office on the 14th floor where her inbox was already filling with emails she had no intention of answering. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow either. Riley was 29 years old, a corporate attorney at Hale & Merritt, and she had not taken an unplanned day off in 3 years. She tracked her time in 6-minute billing increments. She meal prepped on Sundays. She had color-coded her grief the same way she color-coded her case files, neatly, efficiently, invisibly. And still, at 6:22 this morning, she had grabbed her bag, walked past the coffee maker mid-cycle, and left. No note for her mother, no out-of-office reply, no text to Matt, especially not to Matt. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass and watched the suburbs blur into a wash of pale greens and highway grey. A woman across the aisle was FaceTiming someone, laughing at something on her phone screen. The sound too bright for this hour. A teenager 2 rows back had AirPods in, head bobbing to a beat only he could hear. Everyone around her was connected to something. Riley had turned her phone face down in her lap and hadn't touched it since boarding. She wasn't going to New York for any reason she could articulate. There was no meeting, no friend waiting, no plan. She had a hotel confirmation she'd made at 5:40 a.m. on an impulse, using a credit card she thought of as her emergency card, the one she'd never actually used for an emergency before, because she'd spent years convincing herself she didn't have any. Turns out the emergency was just quiet, the kind that wears a blazer and meets its billable hours and says I'm fine with such consistency that even the person saying it starts to believe it. She thought about the conversation she and Matt had on Wednesday, the one that wasn't really a conversation so much as a slow unraveling. They'd been standing in his kitchen, the pendant lights casting that warm amber glow she used to love, and he had said, "Riley, I don't know who you are right now, not cruelly, just honestly." And the most terrifying part wasn't the words, it was that she hadn't known either. The train rocked gently as it gained speed. Outside, a strip of October trees lined the tracks, mostly bare, a few still clinging to rust-colored leaves with the stubbornness of things not quite ready to let go. Riley watched them until they blurred. She'd been good at letting go once. Or maybe she'd just been good at pretending she had. Her tote sat in her lap like a small anchor. Inside it, her laptop, a legal pad she wouldn't write on, her wallet, a charger, lip balm, and a single printed photo she'd folded in half and tucked into the front pocket without fully understanding why. It was from her 24th birthday, a rooftop in Cambridge summer, her hair loose mid-laugh at something she couldn't even remember anymore. She looked present in that photo, unguarded in a way that felt like someone else's life now. She unfolded it, looked at it for a moment, put it back. The coffee cart rattled past and she ordered a black coffee she didn't particularly want, just for the warmth of the paper cup between her palms. The first sip was bitter and thin, the kind of train coffee that made no promises and kept all of them. She held it anyway. Penn Station in 2 hours. After that, she had absolutely no idea. And somehow, for the first time in longer than she could remember, The not knowing didn't feel like failure. It felt like the first honest breath she'd taken in months, raw, a little frightening, slightly too large for her chest, but real. The fog outside had started to lift, just slightly, along the edges. A thin line of pale gold appeared on the horizon where the sky met the trees. Not quite sunrise anymore, not yet full morning. That strange in-between light that belongs to no particular hour. Riley looked at it, and for a moment, she let herself just look. She didn't know yet that in exactly 1 hour and 43 minutes, she would walk off that train and into a moment that would make this quiet morning feel like the last page of a chapter she'd been writing without realizing it. She didn't know about the man with the cello case. Not yet.
Chapter 2.
Penn Station at 8:30 a.m. on a Thursday was its own particular kind of controlled chaos. The kind that had a rhythm if you knew how to listen for it. Sneakers squeaking against polished floors, the mechanical click of departure boards updating overhead. Somewhere near the 7th Avenue entrance, a saxophone player was running through a slow jazz line that nobody was stopping to hear, but everyone was unconsciously absorbing, the notes threading through the crowd like something half-remembered from a dream. Shane Mercer heard it and adjusted his tempo without thinking. That was the thing about being a musician for 15 years. The world stopped being background noise somewhere around year 3, and after that, it was all signal, all information, the way a room breathed, the way silence between two people carried more weight than the words they were actually saying. He'd built a career on that kind of listening, first in small Brooklyn venues with 60 people and bad acoustics, then in proper concert halls where the hush before the first note felt like collective held breath. He was 35, broad-shouldered in a charcoal crewneck and dark jeans, a worn leather strap crossing his chest from the cello case on his back, the kind of case that looked like it had traveled and meant it. He moved through the station with the unhurried ease of someone who'd learned that rushing rarely changed outcomes, his eyes already scanning the departures board out of habit, even though he hadn't decided yet where he was going. That was the truth of it. He'd come to Penn Station to think. It sounded strange when he tried to explain it to people, so mostly he didn't. But thinking for Shane had always worked better when his hands were doing something. And when his hands couldn't hold the bow, walking helped. The station had been his thinking spot since he was 22, and newly arrived in New York with $70, a second-hand instrument, and the specific arrogance of someone who doesn't yet know what they don't know. Today the thinking was about Berlin. The email from the concert house had come Tuesday, a 6-month residency, his own rehearsal space, a small apartment in Mitte, a stipend generous enough to mean something. It was exactly the kind of offer that, 2 years ago, would have made him book the flight before finishing the message. Now it sat in his inbox, read and reread, and he still hadn't typed a single word in response. He told himself he was being careful. He knew somewhere quieter that he was being afraid. He bought a coffee from a kiosk near track 13, dark roast, no sugar, and turned toward the main concourse, letting the crowd move around him. The saxon player had shifted into something more urgent now, the melody climbing. Shane slowed down to listen properly, the cup warming his palm, and that's when he saw her. She was standing just off the main flow of foot traffic, near a support column wrapped in transit ads, completely still in a way that made her visible precisely because everyone else was moving. Dark coat, hair pulled back, a leather tote hanging from one shoulder. She looked composed from a distance, the way someone looks composed when they've been practicing it long enough that it becomes its own kind of exhaustion. But her jaw was set, and she was staring at the departures board with the focused intensity of someone who wasn't actually reading it. Shane recognized the look with uncomfortable accuracy. It was the look of someone standing inside a decision they hadn't finished making yet. He'd seen it in rehearsal rooms, in green rooms before big performances, in his own bathroom mirror approximately 6 days ago. He didn't approach her. That wasn't the impulse. He just didn't look away. She shifted her weight, reached into her coat pocket for her phone, checked the screen, then turned it face down against her thigh. Whatever was on it, she wasn't ready for it. A strand of hair had come loose from her ponytail, and she didn't push it back, which told him more than she probably realized, that some part of her had stopped performing put together, at least for this moment, at least here in the anonymous rush of a Thursday morning station. The saxophone resolved into a long descending phrase and went quiet. In the new silence, something shifted in her expression, a subtle tightening, the particular look of someone who just realized the last plan they had wasn't going to work. Her hand moved to adjust the strap of her tote, and in that movement something about the way she held herself reminded him of a string pulled a half step too tight. Not broken, not yet, but close enough that the difference mattered. Shane took a slow sip of his coffee and stayed where he was, watching the board, not watching her, except that he was, in the peripheral, careful way he watched everything he didn't want to admit was interesting him. Berlin could wait another hour. He didn't know why he thought that, but the thought arrived with the quiet certainty of things that turn out, later, to have been exactly right.
Chapter 3.
It happened in the space of a single distracted moment. Riley had finally made a decision. Coffee, a corner seat somewhere quiet, and a plan assembled from whatever rational pieces she could pull together before noon. She had turned toward the lower level, shifting the tote on her shoulder, already composing the mental checklist that had carried her through every hard day for the last 3 years. Step 1. Step 2. Breathe. Execute. It was the only operating system she trusted. Then someone moved fast against the current of the crowd, a hard shoulder, a practiced pull, and the tote was gone. She spun around, caught a glimpse of dark jacket, a figure already folding into the thick Thursday morning crowd near the 8th Avenue exit, moving with the deliberate casualness of someone who'd done this before. By the time her brain finished processing what her body already knew, there was nothing left to chase. She stood there, wallet, phone, the small folded photograph, her hotel confirmation, her metro card, everything except her laptop, which she'd tucked under her arm to check the departures board, a reflex that now felt, absurdly, like the only lucky thing that had happened to her all week. The crowd continued its indifferent morning surge around her. A family with rolling luggage parted and rejoined like water around a stone. A businessman in a grey suit walked past with his eyes fixed on his phone screen, entirely unaware that someone's entire present situation had just been dismantled in under 4 seconds. Riley opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nobody to tell. Nobody waiting. Nobody who even knew she was here. The particular loneliness of that fact settled over her like cold air. "Hey." The voice came from her left, low, unhurried, carrying no performance of urgency. She turned. The man was maybe 6 feet, cello case strapped across his back, a coffee cup in one hand and his other hand loose at his side. Open posture, nothing aggressive about it, the kind of stillness that suggested he was used to being in loud rooms and had learned not to add to the noise. "I saw what happened," he said. "Not 'I'm so sorry' or 'Are you okay?' Just a clean statement of fact that somehow felt more respectful than sympathy would have." Guy in the black jacket. He was working the column near track 13. Riley looked at him. Her first instinct, honed by 3 years of late nights in a city that occasionally reminded her it didn't care about her personally, was to keep moving. But there was nowhere to move to, and nothing to move with. And the practical reality of her situation was assembling itself in her chest with quiet brutality. No cash, no phone, no ID. "I didn't get a good enough look," she said, mostly to herself. Neither did I, honestly. He tilted his head slightly toward the transit police booth at the far end of the concourse. "You could report it. They'll give you a case number, which will matter later for your cards." He paused. "But they won't find him." "I know." She exhaled, pressed 2 fingers briefly to her temple. "I know, She stopped, reorganized. "I don't have my phone. I can't call anyone. I don't—" Another stop. She looked at the ceiling for exactly 1 second, the way people do when they're deciding whether to fall apart or not, then looked back at him. "I don't actually have a plan right now." Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, she noticed. Something more like recognition. "I know a place about 4 blocks from here," he said. "Good coffee, quiet enough to think. You can use my phone to call your bank, cancel your cards, figure out next steps. He lifted the coffee cup slightly, a small gesture. No obligation. You just look like someone who could use a table and 45 minutes. She studied him for a moment. The cello case, the steady eyes, dark brown, the kind that didn't move around when they were talking to you. The lack of performance in his offer, no oversell, no eagerness. Just the offer. "I'm Riley," she said finally. "Shane." He didn't extend his hand, which she appreciated. It would have felt transactional. Instead, he simply shifted slightly, orienting himself toward the exit in a way that was an invitation rather than an assumption. She fell into step beside him without fully deciding to. They moved through the crowd together, two strangers navigating the same current, his pace measured and easy, hers still slightly braced, still carrying the shape of a morning that had gone entirely sideways. The saxophone had started up again, somewhere behind them. The station did not pause or soften for anyone, but the 4 blocks ahead felt improbably like the first thing all day that resembled solid ground. She hadn't asked where they were going. She realized a half-block out into the cold October air that she didn't mind.
Chapter 4.
The bar had no sign above the door, just a brass number and a single amber bulb mounted beside the frame, the kind of entrance that assumed you already knew it was there or trusted that finding it meant something. Shane pushed the door open, and the smell hit first. Aged wood, a faint trace of leather, something warm and faintly smoky that had nothing to do with cigarettes, and everything to do with years of good whiskey being poured in a room that had learned how to hold it. Riley stepped in behind him and felt the city noise seal off behind the closing door like a sound booth clicking shut. It was early enough that the bar was only half populated, a few people at the counter with their laptops open, a couple in a corner booth speaking quietly over what looked like a shared plate of something warm, a bartender in a black linen shirt, moving glasses with the unhurried precision of someone who took the ritual seriously. The lighting was pendant-style, amber and low, casting everything in the kind of glow that made people look more honest than they might otherwise be. They took a table near the back wall, wood surface, slightly worn at the edges, 2 small candles in glass holders burning low. Shane set his cello case against the wall with the careful ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Not precious about it, but attentive, the way you are with something that matters. "Order whatever you want," he said, settling into his chair across from her. "I've got it." Riley started to object on reflex, the particular instinct of someone who'd spent years making sure she never owed anyone anything. And then stopped herself. She had no wallet, no phone, no reasonable alternative. She folded her hands on the table instead and said simply, "Thank you." The bartender came. Shane ordered a bourbon, neat. Riley asked for a black coffee and then changed her mind at the last second. Actually, whatever red wine you'd recommend, and something about the small spontaneity of it felt significant in a way she couldn't immediately explain. Shane noticed. He didn't comment on it, but the corner of his mouth moved slightly. He handed her his phone first, unlocked, no hesitation, and she spent 10 minutes on hold with her bank, then another 5 cancelling her visa, her voice steady and efficient in the way it always was when she had a task to anchor herself to. She was good in crisis mode. She'd always been good in crisis mode. The problem was that crisis mode had started feeling like her only mode. When she set the phone back on the table, the wine was there. She took a sip and let herself exhale for the first time since Penn Station. "Better?" Shane asked. "Marginally." She almost smiled. "The cards are cancelled. I have a case number. My laptop is still alive." She glanced at it in her bag. "So, technically, I have everything I need to function." "Technically," he agreed, something dry in his tone that suggested he understood the distance between technically and actually. She looked at him across the candlelight. "I'll carry your cello to think," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been turning the detail over since he'd mentioned it outside the station. He tilted his head slightly. "How'd you land on that?" "You said you knew a place near the station, which means you come here regularly. But you had the case with you, which means you didn't come from a rehearsal. You came from home, deliberately, with the instrument." She paused. "People don't carry cellos on the subway for no reason. Shane was quiet for a moment, turning his bourbon glass slowly on the table. The candlelight caught the amber liquid and held it. "It's the weight," he said finally. "When I can't work something out in my head, the weight of carrying it helps, like my body needs to be doing something physical while my brain catches up." He looked at her steadily. "What's your version?" She blinked. Nobody had ever asked her that before. Not phrased that way, not with that particular directness that wasn't aggressive, but simply assumed she had an answer worth hearing. "I take the train," she said slowly, as if she were figuring it out while saying it. "I've always told myself it's practical, but I think—" She stopped, turned her wineglass. "I think I like being in motion without being in control of the direction." The words landed between them and stayed there. Outside, New York continued its relentless Thursday. Cabs honked on West 10th Street. Someone walked past the window in a bright orange puffer jacket, talking loudly into earbuds. The world outside the amber light of this room was loud and indifferent and moving at full speed. In here, something had slowed down. Shane's fingers rested loosely around his glass, and Riley noticed, without meaning to notice, that they were the hands of someone who worked with them. Not rough exactly, but deliberate, shaped by something repeated. She looked up and found him already looking at her. Neither of them looked away immediately. "So," he said, his voice lower now, the bar having grown slightly fuller and slightly louder around them. "What were you actually running from this morning?" The question arrived without cruelty and without strategy, just the particular confidence of someone who already suspected the answer and was giving her space to confirm it. Riley picked up her wineglass, held it, and for the first time all day she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to deflect.
Chapter 5.
The bar had filled gradually, the way good bars do on weekday evenings, not with a rush but with a slow accumulation of people who needed somewhere to be that wasn't home and wasn't work. The ambient noise had thickened into a comfortable hum, the kind that gave conversations a natural privacy, without requiring anyone to lower their voice dramatically. Riley had been watching a couple in the booth diagonal from theirs for the last few minutes without fully realizing it. They were somewhere in their mid-40s, dressed like people who'd come straight from offices, her in a blazer with the collar slightly rumpled, him with his tie loosened, and his jacket folded beside him. They weren't fighting exactly. They were doing something quieter and more complicated than fighting, having a disagreement in the subdued, abbreviated language of two people who had said most of the available words on this particular subject before, and were now navigating the familiar territory of it with the weary efficiency of a route they knew too well. And yet, between the low exchanges, his hand rested near hers on the table, not touching, just near. "You're watching them," Shane said. Riley didn't deny it. "They've been together a long time." "How do you know?" "They're not performing anything for each other." She tilted her wineglass slightly. "When people are new, there's always a little theatre. They've stopped doing that. What they have left is just the actual thing, whatever that is." Shane glanced over briefly, then back at her. "You think that's sad or reassuring?" She considered it honestly. "I think I used to know, and now I'm not sure." Near the window, a man sat alone at a small two-top with a glass of scotch and a paperback he wasn't reading. He was somewhere in his late 60s, silver-haired, good coat, the comfortable self-containment of someone who had arrived at his own company as a destination rather than a consolation. He didn't look lonely. He looked, if anything, settled in a way that was either deeply peaceful or deeply resigned. And the difference between those two things felt, from a distance, almost impossible to determine. Shane had noticed him too. "I can't decide if I want to be him someday," Shane said quietly, "or if I'm already halfway there and don't know it." The honesty of it surprised her. She looked at him. "You live alone," she said. Also not a question. "Brooklyn." "Yeah." He didn't elaborate immediately. Turning his bourbon glass in that slow thinking rotation she was already starting to recognize as his particular tell. "I had a 4-year relationship that ended about 18 months ago. Since then it's been the apartment, the instrument, and whatever the work requires." He paused. "It's a good life. I'm not complaining about it." "But," Riley said. He looked at her with something that might have been appreciation for the shortcut. But sometimes I'm not sure if I'm living it or just maintaining it. The word landed somewhere specific in Riley's chest. She set her glass down. Outside the window, a young woman walked past in an oversized puffer jacket, laughing at something on her phone screen, entirely luminous with the uncomplicated joy of someone whose evening was going exactly as planned. "Daniel," Riley said. It was the first time she'd said his name out loud all day. It came out quieter than she intended, carrying less bitterness than she expected, just the particular exhaustion of a word that had been carried too long. "How long?" Shane asked. 2 years. She smoothed a small crease in the tablecloth with one finger. "He's a good person. That's the part that makes it hard to explain. There's nothing wrong with him. He's attentive and stable and completely present in a way that should feel like exactly what I needed." She stopped, restarted. "But I kept waiting to feel unchosen, not just comfortable. And I don't think he could give me that. And I don't think I was giving him what he actually needed either. And at some point, the kindest thing would have been to say it out loud instead of just getting very good at being busy." The couple in the corner had gone quiet now, the woman's hand turned palm up on the table, the man's fingers finally resting in hers. Not a resolution, just a pause. A breath taken together in the middle of something unfinished. "You left without telling him where you were going," Shane said. "I left without telling anyone." She met his eyes. "Which is either very brave or very cowardly, and I genuinely don't know which yet." "Maybe it's both," he said. "Maybe that's allowed." The candle between them had burned lower, the flames steadier now in the undisturbed air of the back corner. Riley became aware, gradually then all at once, that her shoulders had dropped. That the careful architecture of composure she'd been maintaining since 6:22 that morning had loosened somewhere between the second glass of wine and this specific conversation with this specific stranger, who kept asking the right questions without making them feel like interrogations. She noticed, without meaning to, the way his forearms rested on the table. The steadiness of him, the quality of his attention, not hungry, not performing interest, just genuinely quietly present, in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. She looked down at her own fingers on the tablecloth. They had stopped moving. She hadn't noticed when that happened, only that something in her had gone still, and that the stillness felt less like emptiness than it had in a very long time. Shane watched her without comment, with the careful patience of someone who understood that some things needed a moment before they were ready to be spoken. The bar murmured around them. The candle held its flame, and neither of them reached for a reason to leave.
Chapter 6.
The Soho street was the kind of quiet that only exists in New York after 10 p.m. on a weeknight. Not silence exactly, but a reduction, the city having pulled its volume down a few notches without fully committing to stillness. The storefronts were dark behind their security gates, the iron painted over in layers of blackened charcoal that caught the streetlight in dull metallic strips. Somewhere a block over, a car passed with its bass turned up, the sound arriving and dissolving like a pulse. Riley walked with her hands in her coat pockets, her breath making small clouds in the October air. Shane moved beside her with the cello case on his back, his pace unhurried, the leather strap cutting diagonally across the chest of his jacket. They had left the bar without a specific destination, which had felt like a mutual, unspoken agreement, the kind that didn't require negotiation because both people arrived at it simultaneously. "Can I ask you something?" Riley said. "You've been asking me things all night," Shane said. "Don't stop now. When did you know it was what you were supposed to do, the cello?" He was quiet for a moment, their footsteps finding an easy rhythm on the pavement. "I was 11. My uncle had one in his apartment. He didn't play, he'd bought it at an estate sale because he liked how it looked. I picked up the bow one afternoon while he was in the kitchen and drew it across the open strings." He paused. "It's the resonance, the way it vibrates in your sternum if you're standing close enough, like the instrument is speaking directly to your body rather than your ears." He glanced at her sideways. "I know that sounds—" "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." They turned onto a narrower street, the buildings pressing closer on either side, a row of cast-iron facades rising into the dark above them. At the end of the block, a wide delivery entrance was recessed slightly into the building. A shallow alcove of shadow and old brick, a loading dock long closed for the night. Shane stopped. He unslung the case from his back with practiced ease, set it flat against the base of the wall and crouched to unzip it. The latches released with two soft metallic clicks that echoed slightly in the narrow street. He lifted the cello out with both hands, rosewood brown in the streetlight, the varnish worn smooth at the edges of the upper bout where years of playing had left their mark. Riley stood back and watched him settle into position. No chair, just standing, the instrument braced against his body, his left hand finding the neck with the unconscious certainty of muscle memory so deep it had become biology. He didn't tune it, didn't prepare. He simply placed the bow and played. It wasn't a piece. It wasn't a performance. It was something between the two. A series of arpeggios moving up the register, unhurried, the bow drawing long even strokes that filled the empty street with something warm and resonant and completely unexpected. The notes climbed the brick walls and hung in the cold air, and Riley felt them before she processed them. A low vibration that started somewhere near her feet and moved upward through her chest. She stood 2 steps away and did not move. She was not a person who cried easily. She had trained herself out of it somewhere around her 2nd year of law school, when she had decided that composure was armor and armor was survival. But something in the sound, in the specific frequency of it against the silence of that particular street at that particular hour, moved through the carefully maintained structure of her and found something underneath it that had not been touched in a very long time. Not grief, not quite joy. Something older than both, recognition maybe, the feeling of being reminded of something you forgot you knew. Shane played for perhaps 3 minutes, then the bow slowed, and the last note sustained and dissolved into the October air like breath. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, fuller, inhabited. He lowered the bow and looked at her. Riley realized she had taken 1 step closer without noticing. She was near enough now to see the slight movement of his breathing, the way the streetlight caught the angle of his jaw, the stillness in his expression that was not blankness but its opposite, a complete, focused presence that made the space between them feel charged in a way that had nothing to do with the music and everything to do with what the music had opened. Neither of them spoke. The distance between them was perhaps 18 inches. She was aware of it with an attention that she usually reserved for things requiring her full professional concentration, acute, precise, impossible to redirect. His eyes moved over her face with the same unhurried quality she'd noticed all evening, and what she found there wasn't hunger or urgency. It was something quieter and more unsettling than either. The look of someone paying very close attention to something he hadn't expected to find important. She didn't step back. He didn't move forward. The moment held itself between them, fragile and complete, like a note at the end of its sustain, still technically sounding but already beginning its return to silence. Then Shane exhaled slowly, looked down at the instrument in his hands, and the moment shifted without breaking, changed into something else, something that carried the same charge but different shape. He began carefully returning the cello to its case. Riley turned her face slightly toward the street, breathing the cold air, her heart moving at a tempo that had nothing to do with walking. Whatever that was, it had not finished.
Chapter 7.
The diner was the kind of place that existed in defiant opposition to everything New York had become. No reclaimed wood, no curated playlist, no small batch anything. Just fluorescent light humming at a frequency slightly too present to ignore, laminate tabletops in a shade of yellow that belonged to no particular decade, and a coffee that arrived without being asked for in a white ceramic mug that had been through enough cycles to have lost any memory of its original brightness. Riley wrapped both hands around the mug anyway. It was past 11. The diner was running at its late-night population, a construction worker at the counter with a plate of eggs, and his phone propped against the napkin dispenser, 2 college-aged girls in the far booth sharing a slice of pie, and a conversation that kept dissolving into laughter, a man in a postal uniform eating soup with the focused silence of someone on a timer. The waitress, A woman somewhere in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into silver-streaked hair had taken their order with the brisk efficiency of someone who had heard every possible human story and was no longer surprised by any of it. Shane sat across from Riley with his coffee untouched, his forearms on the table, the cello case propped against the wall behind him. The fluorescent light was unambiguous and slightly unkind, the kind of light that removed the atmospheric assistance of amber pendants and candlelight and replaced it with something more honest. People looked more like themselves in diners at midnight. There was nowhere particularly flattering to hide. Riley found she didn't mind. "Okay," Shane said. Not a preamble, an arrival. Like he'd been working towards something since they left the Soho street and had finally decided to cover the remaining distance. Why New York, actually? She turned her mug slightly on the table. "I told you. The train—" "You told me the mechanism," he said, "not the reason." She looked at him across the unforgiving light. He wasn't pushing. He was just waiting with the particular patience of someone who understood that the real answer was already in the room and simply needed a moment to be acknowledged. She exhaled. "I went to New York," she said slowly, "to find out if I could want something different." She paused. "Let the next part come at its own pace. I've spent 2 years being very competent at a life I'm not sure I chose. The career, I'm good at it. Matt, he's good to me. Everything is functional, optimized." She looked down at the coffee, and I woke up 3 weeks ago at 4 a.m. and lay there in the dark thinking, if nothing changes, this is just it. This is the whole thing. And I didn't feel sad about it. I felt nothing. And the nothing scared me more than sadness would have. The diner hummed around them. A burst of laughter from the far booth quickly settled. "So I came here to feel something that wasn't scheduled," she finished. "And then someone stole my bag, and I ended up in a bar in the West Village talking to a cellist, so—" She lifted her mug. "Methodology questionable. Results inconclusive." Shane smiled at that. A real one, not polished, reaching his eyes with the slight asymmetry of something unguarded. Then he picked up his own mug, and the smile faded into something more considered. "Berlin," he said. She waited. "There's a residency. 6 months. Starts in January. It's a good offer. Genuinely good, the kind I would have taken without thinking 2 years ago." He turned the mug slowly. "I've been staring at the email for 3 days without responding." "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she understood the silence was part of the answer. "Because the last time I took a big opportunity to leave," he said carefully, "it was right after Clara and I ended. And I told myself it was professional growth, and it was. But it was also running. And I got very good at making running look like ambition." He set the mug down. "I don't want to do that again, but I also don't know how to tell the difference anymore between leaving because you're ready and leaving because you're afraid to stay." The words settled between them with the weight of something that had needed to be said out loud for longer than tonight. Riley looked at him. In the flat, honest light of the diner, with the coffee going lukewarm between them and the city doing its indifferent late-night thing outside the plate-glass window, she felt something clarify. Not dramatically, not with any particular fanfare, but with the quiet irreversibility of a decision the body makes before the mind catches up. She recognized him. Not in the way of having met before, in the way of 2 people who had been solving the same problem from opposite ends and had just in a fluorescent-lit diner on a Thursday night arrived at the same page. "We're the same kind of lost," she said. It wasn't a consolation. It was an observation, precise and even, the way she stated facts in depositions when she was most certain of them. Shane held her gaze. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We are." Outside, a cab rolled through a puddle left by an earlier rain, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window and moving on. The postal worker finished his soup, left exact change, and walked out into the night without looking back. The waitress refilled their coffee without asking. Neither of them reached for a reason to move. But something had shifted. Not loudly, not with any gesture that could be pointed to later as the moment. Just a quiet molecular rearrangement of the space between 2 people who had stopped pretending they weren't paying close attention to each other. The coffee steamed. The light hummed. And the night, somehow, still had more to say.
Chapter 8.
Carroll Gardens at 4 a.m. had the specific quality of a city holding its breath. The streets were wet from rain that had passed through sometime after midnight, leaving the pavement dark and reflective. The streetlights doubled in the shallow puddles along the curb. The brownstones rose on either side of the sidewalk in their familiar Brooklyn uniformity. Iron railings, stone stoops, the occasional jack-o'-lantern still posted beside a front door 2 weeks past Halloween, slightly collapsed, but still committed. A cat moved along the top of a garden wall and disappeared without sound. Riley walked beside Shane with her arms crossed loosely against the cold, her breath visible in short, pale clouds. The laptop bag hung from her shoulder, the only thing that remained of the morning she'd left Boston with. Everything else was gone or cancelled or suspended. She had not spoken to Matt. She had not checked her email. She had existed, for the last several hours, entirely outside the architecture of her regular life. And the sensation was less like freedom than like standing in a room after all the furniture has been removed, disorienting and clarifying in equal measure. Shane's friend's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building on President Street. A favor called in via a single text message sent from the diner, answered within 2 minutes with a door code and a characteristically brief couch is yours, key under the mat. Don't wake the cat. Shane had explained without elaborating that Marcus traveled for work and kept a spare key in rotation among a small group of people he trusted with the particular intimacy of his living space. Riley had accepted this information with the practical gratitude of someone who had run out of alternatives and found an unexpected one. They climbed the stairs in a silence that had changed quality over the course of the evening. No longer the silence of two strangers being careful with each other, but something worn in like a jacket that had been broken down to the shape of its wearer. Their footsteps were quiet on the carpeted stairs. On the 2nd floor landing, a neighbor's television murmured through a closed door. The sound reduced to a low, unintelligible warmth. Shane found the key, unlocked the door, and pushed it open into the dark. The apartment smelled like old books and coffee, and something faintly citrus, a lived-in smell, comfortable and specific to someone else's life. A lamp clicked on in the entryway, casting a low amber circle across a hallway lined with framed photographs and an overloaded coat rack. At the far end of the hall, a large orange cat sat upright on a wooden chair and regarded them with the sovereign indifference of an animal that had decided long ago that humans were mostly irrelevant. "That's Monk," Shane said quietly. "Of course it is," Riley said. The cat blinked once and looked away. Shane set the cello case against the entryway wall with practiced care and turned. They were standing perhaps 4 feet apart in the narrow hallway, the lamplight falling across the angle of his face, the framed photographs making a kind of gallery of other people's moments around them, weddings, shorelines, birthdays, the accumulated evidence of a life lived in connection. Riley looked at him. The evening had the texture of something that had been building toward a point, not urgently, not with the manufactured tension of a situation engineering itself toward an outcome, but with the natural and patient momentum of two people who had been honest with each other in a succession of small ways and had arrived collectively, somewhere they hadn't planned to be and didn't want to leave. Shane looked back at her with an expression she had been trying to read all evening, and could now finally read clearly, not because it had changed, but because she had stopped being afraid of what it said. It was the look of someone who had made a decision without rehearsing the moment, certain without being urgent, present without any performance of it. Her heart was moving at a pace that had nothing to do with the stairs. She didn't step back. He crossed the remaining distance between them slowly, not hesitantly, but with the same deliberate attention he gave to everything, as if the space between where he had been standing and where she was deserved to be covered with full awareness. His hand came up and found the side of her face with a gentleness that was more undoing than urgency could ever have been. His thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with the same precision and intention she had watched him bring to the bow. She closed her eyes. His forehead dropped to hers and they stood like that for a breath, just a breath. In the amber light of someone else's hallway, the city sealed outside, the cat indifferent, the photographs bearing quiet witness. Then, The lamp in the hallway reached the end of its automatic timer, and the light went out. The darkness was warm and absolute and entirely chosen. Not something that happened to them, but something they had been, in their separate and converging ways, moving towards since a Thursday morning platform when two people carrying the same unfinished question had found each other in the middle of a crowd and recognized something they hadn't known they were looking for. Outside, the Brooklyn sky had begun its slow, almost imperceptible shift, the deepest black giving way at its edges to something that was not yet grey but was no longer entirely dark. The night was almost finished. The morning was almost ready. And whatever came with it, neither of them would be facing it the same way they had faced the day before.
Chapter 9.
Brooklyn on a Sunday morning in late October had a quality of light that existed nowhere else, or at least that was what Riley thought when she opened her eyes and found it coming through the window in long, unhurried bands of gold, falling across the unfamiliar ceiling of an unfamiliar room with the particular generosity of a sun that had decided for once not to be in any hurry. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory the way she always did upon waking, except that the usual inventory, the one that began with the day's schedule and moved efficiently through obligations and timestamps and the quiet weight of everything pending, didn't arrive. Instead, there was just the ceiling, the light, the sound of the city outside doing its early Sunday version of itself, slower, gentler. A garbage truck somewhere distant, a dog being walked on the street below, someone's music drifting from a window 2 floors up, something with piano and no particular urgency. She turned her head. Shane was sitting on the edge of the bed with his back partially to her, 2 ceramic mugs on the nightstand beside him, steam rising from both in slow, unhurried curls. He was in a grey Henley and dark jeans, his feet bare on the wooden floor, and he was looking out the window at the morning with the expression of someone entirely at peace with not yet doing anything about it. He hadn't heard her wake. She watched him for a moment, the line of his shoulders, the way his hands rested loosely in his lap, the quality of stillness in him that she had noticed in the station and the bar and the Soho street, and that she understood now was not performed calm, but the real thing, the kind that comes from having spent years learning to be present inside silence rather than afraid of it. Something in her chest moved in a way that was warm and slightly frightening and entirely welcome. "For you made coffee," she said. He turned. The expression that crossed his face when he saw her awake was unguarded in a way that landed somewhere specific. Not a smile exactly, something quieter and more considered than a smile, the look of someone who had expected to feel uncertain about this morning and had discovered upon its arrival that he didn't. "Marcus has good beans," he said. "French press. I hope that's okay." "It's more than okay." She pushed herself up against the headboard and reached for one of the mugs, and when her fingers closed around the warm ceramic she felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was completely present. Not performing presence, not managing the moment from behind the careful glass of her usual composure, but actually entirely here, in this room, in this light, in this unexpected morning that she had not planned and could not have predicted and would not have traded. Shane turned more fully toward her, one knee bent on the bed, and for a moment they simply existed in the same space with the coffee and the Sunday light and the comfortable absence of any requirement to fill it with words. "How are you?" he asked eventually. Simply. She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I feel like someone opened a window I'd forgotten was there." She paused. "That probably sounds—" "No," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. "How are you?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she heard the garbage truck turn a corner and fade, and the piano music drift and settle, and somewhere below a child laugh at something on the street with the complete and uncomplicated abandon of a person for whom the morning holds no complications. "I feel like I haven't been this awake in a long time," Shane said, "and I don't mean—" He stopped, restarted with the precision of someone who wanted to get this right. "I mean awake like present, like the thing I've been thinking around for months is suddenly something I can look at directly." "Berlin," she said. "Among other things." His eyes stayed on hers. She looked down at the coffee, The steam had thinned, the mug cooling at the pace of all things left to their natural progression, unhurried and honest. Outside, the light had shifted slightly, the gold deepening toward the particular richness of mid-morning, the shadows shortening on the brownstone wall visible through the window. His hand found hers on the linen, not with urgency, but with the same intentionality she had come to recognize as his particular signature. The way he did everything, with full awareness of where he was placing himself and why. His fingers settled over hers with the quiet precision of someone who knew exactly where to land. She turned her hand and let his fingers find the spaces between hers. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I have a train at 6:45, she said eventually. Not as a departure announcement, as a fact being offered for consideration, set on the table between them, the way you set down something you're not sure yet whether to pick back up. Shane nodded slowly, his thumb moving once across her knuckles in a gesture so small and deliberate, it felt like punctuation. "I know," he said. The coffee continued to cool. The light continued to move across the ceiling in its slow, golden progression. The morning held them both with the particular patience of something that understood it had arrived at exactly the right moment and was in no hurry to become afternoon. But the 6:45 was still out there, and the question of what she would do when she reached the platform had not yet been asked out loud by either of them, which meant it was the only thing in the room.
Chapter 10.
Penn Station at 6:20 a.m. on a Friday was a different animal than the Thursday morning chaos that had swallowed Riley whole less than 24 hours ago. The crowds were thinner, the pace less frantic, the departure board cycling through its updates with a mechanical patience that felt almost contemplative at this hour. The coffee kiosks were just opening, the smell of fresh grounds cutting through the stale, recycled air of the underground concourse in a way that was almost aggressively optimistic. Riley stood at the entrance to Track 9 with a new tote bag, bought from a 24-hour pharmacy on Atlantic Avenue at 5:45 a.m., navy blue and slightly too large, the kind of bag that made no particular statement, and her ticket in her hand. Boston, departing 6:45, arriving South Station 10:12. She had checked in online from Shane's phone, cancelled her hotel reservation, and sent a single text to her assistant that said in early Monday, hold everything until then. Professional, clean, no explanation offered. She had not yet texted Matt. Shane stood beside her with the cello case on his back and his hands in the pockets of his jacket, his eyes on the track entrance with the expression of someone working very hard at being present and finding it more difficult than usual. They had taken the subway from Carroll Gardens in the specific silence of two people who have said most of the important things and are now navigating the gap between what has been said and what comes next, that narrow, consequential corridor where everything is still in motion and nothing has been fixed in place yet. On the platform, a family arranged themselves around a luggage cart with the organized chaos of people who had done this before. A young man in a business suit checked his watch twice in 30 seconds. A conductor in a Navy uniform moved along the platform with the unhurried authority of someone whose relationship with departure schedules had long since passed from professional into philosophical. "I want to say something," Shane said, not looking at her yet, his voice low enough that it belonged only to this 6 feet of platform, without it sounding like pressure. "Say it," Riley said. He turned. In the flat early light of the station, without the assistance of amber bars or Brooklyn sunrise or Soho street lamps, he looked exactly like himself. No atmospheric enhancement, no borrowed romance of setting. Just a 35-year-old man with a cello on his back, and something in his expression that was steady and unperformed and entirely serious. "Last night wasn't something I'm going to file away," he said. "I don't know what it means practically, and I don't know what you're going back to or what I'm deciding about Berlin, or what any of this looks like in 2 weeks. But I know that I haven't felt that, present, in longer than I want to admit, and I think you know that too." Riley looked at him for a long moment, the departure board above them updated with a soft mechanical click. Track 9, 6:45, Boston, on time. The doors of the train opened. The family with the luggage cart began their organized migration toward the entrance. The businessman moved forward with his rollerboard. The conductor stepped back, and the slow, purposeful loading of a train began its familiar choreography around them. Riley looked at the open doors, the lit interior of the car. Seat 14C, probably, or something equally anonymous, equally removed, equally pointed toward the life she had left yesterday morning in a state of quiet emergency. She thought about her apartment, her desk, the color-coded calendar on her laptop, the inbox, the careful, optimized, impeccably maintained structure of a life that worked by every measurable standard and had stopped, somewhere along the way, feeling like hers. She thought about Matt, not with guilt, but with the specific clarity of someone who has finally stopped lying to themselves about something and can now see it plainly. He deserved honesty. She had known that for longer than she'd acted on it. She looked back at Shane, and she didn't get on the train. Not dramatically. No drop ticket, no running, no cinematic pivot, just a simple, quiet, irrevocable stillness. She stayed where she was while the passengers moved around her, and the decision settled into her body with the calm finality of something that had been true for a while and had simply finally been acknowledged. The doors remained open for another 40 seconds. Then they closed. The train began to move. Riley watched it go. Then she took her phone, retrieved yesterday from the transit lost and found through a minor miracle in Shane's patient negotiation, and called Matt. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the particular alertness of someone who had been expecting this call without knowing when it would come. "Hey," she said, "I need to talk to you, not to explain where I've been, just to be honest in a way I should have been a long time ago." There was a pause. Then Matt said quietly, "I know." And in those two words was the exhausted dignity of someone who had also been waiting, not for this specific call, but for the truth it carried, which had been present between them long enough that its arrival was more relief than wound. She kept it brief. She kept it kind. She kept it true. When she hung up, Shane was watching her with his hands still in his pockets, his expression neither triumphant nor relieved, just present, steady, the same quality of attention he had brought to everything since a Thursday morning platform when the world had been moving at full speed and he had chosen, for reasons he couldn't have articulated then, to slow down and look. He pulled out his own phone, opened his email, found the Concerthouse message, sitting read and unanswered in his inbox like a question that had been waiting for the right moment to become answerable. He typed, "Thank you for your patience. I'd like to request an additional month before confirming. There are things here I'm not yet finished with." He sent it before he could reconsider. Then he looked up at Riley, and something in his face shifted, not into certainty because certainty wasn't what either of them had arrived at, and they both understood that. What they had was something more honest than certainty. Two people standing in the same early morning light, having chosen separately and simultaneously to stop moving away from the things that mattered. Riley slid her unused return ticket into the outer pocket of the navy tote. "I need coffee," she said. "Real coffee. Not station coffee." Shane almost smiled. "I know a place." "You always know a place." "It's a skill," he said. They walked back through the concourse together, no luggage between them except the cello, no plan beyond the next hour, no guarantees about any of the hours after that. The departure board cycled through its updates above them. Other trains were leaving for other cities, carrying other people toward their various destinations and obligations and unfinished stories. Riley didn't look back at track 9. She kept her eyes forward on the exit, on the October morning assembling itself above the city streets, cold and bright and entirely open, the kind of morning that makes no promises and offers everything. It was, she thought, more than enough. She didn't choose the easier path. She chose the honest one, and there's a difference that most people spend years pretending doesn't exist. Riley boarded a train to escape a life that fit perfectly on paper, but had stopped fitting anywhere that mattered. What she found instead wasn't a rescue. It was a mirror. Someone who recognized the weight she was carrying because he'd been carrying the same thing in a different shape, on a different shoulder, for just as long. That's the thing about the moments that change us. They rarely arrive announced. They come disguised as missed trains, stolen bags, wrong turns, and strangers with cellos who know a quiet place to think. They come when we've finally run out of ways to avoid ourselves. Riley and Shane didn't find a fairy tale. They found something harder and realer than that. The courage to stop performing a life and start choosing one. And maybe that's the question worth sitting with tonight. What are you still waiting to choose? If this story landed somewhere real for you, hit like, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Your presence here means everything.
Thank you for feeling with me. I am David, and I will be here when you return.